Welcome back, everybody, to the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and University of Wyoming Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series that we provide to you on a monthly basis. So I'm Melinda Ellison, the University of Idaho Extension Sheep Specialist. Your other co-hosts for this webinar series are Carmen Wilmore, also with the University of Idaho as an extension educator. We have Chad Page, who's the specialist, sheep and goat specialist for Utah State University, and then Whit Stewart, who is with University of Wyoming as the sheep specialist. So we are all here and available to help you as needed, as always. So today, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague from the University of Idaho, Yana Hamlet, and she is our food processing specialist. And so we have a treat for you today to talk about some of those products that you guys may be selling, any food products. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Welcome. Glad to be invited. Thank you, Melinda, for inviting me to chat with everybody today on your webinar. My focus area really is food processors, food manufacturers. Everything from small, so home kind of entrepreneurs, sell at farmers markets kind of thing, to your large multinational, brands that will be in those retail markets that we all purchase. So I am based in Idaho. Let me get next slide here. Yep. I have a joint appointment with University of Idaho and Tech Help, which is Idaho's manufacturing extension partner. Every state has an MAP center. So Utah, you have Impact Utah, and Wyoming, you have one as well. And so all of those that are in the US, you have an MEP center. Not all the MEP centers have food as part of their expertise, but Idaho does. And so I was come today to kind of chat with you guys about food safety plans and just answer any questions you may have about selling your products. My understanding is most of you are probably going to have meat products, or you're going to have some dairy products like cheese and yogurt and things like that. And so really that's my expertise is food manufacturing, everything from dealing with food safety and regulatory to operational efficiencies to people safety stuff, any of those kinds of things. And so today's presentation is really just focused on food safety plans. And so I've got some discussion over why do we even need to have a food safety plan, some of the benefits of a food safety plan. And then we're going to go over just some very quickly, some of the 5 pre-steps and 7 principles that are in how you go about creating your own food safety plan. So for those of you that are selling food products, you do have to have a food safety plan, and we'll talk about that. There's kind of 2 approaches, and regulatory has some stuff in there, and it all becomes nice and easy to understand, as comes with anything regulatory, right? But we're going to talk a little bit about, some of the supporting systems that comes with a food safety plan, and then just really have some time to answer questions. So I've got quite a bit of information on these slides, but we're not going to necessarily go through every single slide verbatim. And so I will skip over some of this. If you have any questions or thoughts or concerns, feel free to throw them into the question box. We will have some time at the end. And then I also have my contact information there at the end. And so feel free to reach out. Glad to help. So let's just get started. So why do we need a food safety plan? Well, food safety plan, its main purpose is to be preventive. It's not meant to be a reactive situation. So it's meant to take a really scrutinizing look at your process and analyze what are any of the food safety concerns with you making your product, and put in policies, procedures, practices, things like that to prevent those issues from occurring, so that you don't run into something like a recall. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the costs of a recall and how, you know, if you're a small business, you really can't absorb it. And so a lot of times it's business ending. When we talk about a food safety plan, there's really two big components. There's the food safety plan itself, but there's also all the support mechanism that comes around. And we call those either prerequisite programs or preventive controls. And we're going to talk about some of those, just again, high level. This is not meant to be a webinar where you can be completely ready to take care of your food safety plan just by listening to me yammer on for an hour or so. But it's meant to give you kind of an understanding and thoughts and ideas. And then I've got a lot of resources on here that you can find on the web that are free. And then, of course, reaching out to your extension specialists. Many of them have experience. And then there's a lot of other resources like your MEP centers. And then, of course, there's always consultants and things like that. So recalls are never good. Everybody's blood pressure goes up as soon as you say even the word recall, because it's a lot of time and energy, and it takes a lot of money and manpower to manage. And if you're a small business, that's generally what you do not have a bunch of, is money and manpower, right? And so you can see there's some figures. These are a little dated. They haven't really published a very good updated ones, and so I need to go through and see if I can find something. But in 2011, so that's over 10 years ago, so you can imagine inflation and things like that. The average cost of a recall was $10 million. But yet you can see that nearly a quarter of them exceeded $30 million. And so, again, like I said, if you're a small business, you don't generally have that much sitting in the savings account on the slush fund waiting to be spent. And so when we think about recalls, you know, think about all the costs associated with a food safety issue. There's the, heaven forbid, kind of situation of where somebody actually dies from eating your product. Nobody wants to have a product that makes somebody else sick, but that happens with food. CDC says 3,000 people die every year in the US from eating contaminated food and drinking materials as well. But there's a lot of other costs. So hopefully it's not a fatality situation. But even just thinking about, you know, you have to get all of the product back, you have to replace product, distribution costs of how do you go ahead and notify your customers, how do you get that product back, you've got to deal with regulatory. Some of you may be large enough that you have grocery stores or retail that you ship to, and so you've got to notify them, they've got to get all the product back. You're going to have to pay for all of that. They're not going to do that out of the goodness of their hearts. Those of you that sell at like farmers markets and things like that, trying to just get a hold of everybody. If you have the records, hopefully you do, but sometimes you don't. And so just thinking of that. And then also, you know, trying to understand if it's not going to be business ending, being able to maintain a customer base. And a lot of those costs of a recall are really indirect. They're hard for us to measure, because how do you measure customer goodwill? Those of you that have been sick by food that you've eaten, you probably are not so excited about eating that food again, because generally it's not a pleasant experience. And so you don't want to repeat it. And so it's that loss of customers, right? And it's that loss of where you used to have, you know, a pretty good customer base, and now not so much because somebody got sick or because of the recall. So that's what food safety plans are trying to do, right? They're just trying to prevent recall situations. They're trying to prevent those food safety incidents from occurring with your product. That way you never have to deal with that situation. So when we talk about food safety plans, we have to talk about both HACCP and the preventive controls for human food. So there's really two kind of methods for developing your food safety plan. They're very similar, but they do have some nuances. They do have some differences. So HACCP's been around since the 60s, was created by Pillsbury and US Army, and NASA and trying to figure out how we're going to feed these astronauts that we're going to shoot off of Earth in this little metal tube. Because you can imagine that NASA really doesn't want to have to deal with foodborne illness in space. That's a complication they didn't want to have to try to deal with. And we didn't have a very good food safety system at that point. And so that's where HACCP sprang up from. HACCP is a worldwide food safety system. You will find it recognized in pretty much every country of the world when it comes to food manufacturing and food safety. But then we also have the preventive controls for human food. And that's now been around since 2011. So we're going on more than 10 years for that as well. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed by then President Obama. The Food Safety Modernization Act is shortened to FSMA. So you might have heard FSMA, or you might have heard HACCP. That was our industry way of mangling HACCP, making it into the preventive controls. You will find regulators really hate HACCP. So if you are in the company of a regulator, don't say HACCP. Preventive controls for human food, your PC plan. Again, both of these are meant to be food safety wise. They're meant to be preventive. They're meant to be systematic. So they each have step by step. And we're going to talk about what those steps are as you develop your food safety plan, or you modify and update and continuously improve maybe one you already have. So really, when we talk about food safety, regulatory, federal side bodies, you really have USDA, who does meat, poultry, and eggs. So you have the Meat Inspection Act, Egg Inspection Act. Those are going to be HACCP based. Okay, so 1995, our pathogen control, USDA mandated that you had to have a HACCP plan for your food safety. So those of you that are making meat, poultry, and eggs products, those would fall under, as far as the federal jurisdiction, under USDA. Now, FDA is all other food groups. So those of you that are making dairy products, so like cheeses and yogurts and ice creams and fluid milk itself, that falls under FDA. Now, again, keep in mind, these are the federal bodies. And so if you just sell within your state, then you fall under usually either a Department of Health situation, or maybe your local state Department of Ag. You know, each state kind of handles how they deal with that. Every state has a food code of some kind. It's usually modeled off the FDA food code, but there's always modifications for each state. And then even within your state, we even in Idaho, we have multiple health districts, and how each health district, from one from itself, and you know, one that's in the north or one that's in the south, they even handle things a little differently. And so if you're an FDA facility, it's a preventive controls. Your food safety plan has to meet that PC rule. If you're a USDA facility, the meat, poultry, and eggs, you got to meet the HACCP. The state, it's a mixed bag, because it depends on the state, and it depends upon whether it's health district or Department of Ag. Some of them are going to be much more open to the federal guidelines. Some of them are going to be still HACCP. So talk to your state guidance there and see what they tell you. So if you do not engage in interstate commerce, so if you do not sell out of state lines, you just fall under your state rules. So your state food codes, health districts, Department of Ag, that's who you're going to have as your regulatory body. When you start engaging in interstate commerce, so if you have a website and somebody from an out of state has an address and you mail it there, you have now engaged in interstate commerce. And so then you do fall under federal purview. Now, we can make this even more messier, and we are not going to get into that. Melinda said you did have a guest speaker about regulatory and things like that. So we won't get into too much, but many times, depending upon the state, you might even have your state officer serve as the FDA or USDA inspector. And so again, just like I facetiously said that whenever we talk about regulatory, it becomes all clear. It's not. So reach out, chat if you have individual experiences that you want to have some questions about. But That's all we're going to talk about for regulatory. So keep in mind, HACCP or preventive controls for human food, they're both out there. Both are required or can be used to develop your food safety plan. It might be good, Melinda, for us to go ahead and throw that poll out there to see who all has a food safety plan already. And so you should see there popping up on your screen a question about, do you currently have a food safety plan? And we'll just give a couple of moments to see who all already has one or what you're thinking about that. And while that poll is going, we'll go ahead and jump to the next slide here. So when we start talking about developing your food safety plan, there are 5 preliminary steps and 7 principles. And that's going to be the same for both HACCP and the preventive controls. HACCP requires the 5 preliminary steps. The PC rule has them as being highly recommended, but not necessarily required. I have my own bias that I don't see how you can create a good hazard analysis without a flow diagram and without a team. So I say it's pretty much a needed item, but again, by the rules, by the regs, it's not. So Melinda, did we get everybody get a chance to vote, or do I need to give more time?
Well, you've got about 60% of the participants who have participated. So if you guys want to jump on and fill out that poll, maybe we give them another 30 seconds or so.
Okay, no problem. So when we talk about the preliminary steps, your first preliminary step is to assemble a food safety team or a HACCP team. Those of you that are small, you already understand that you're going to be wearing many hats, and you know, if you don't have a lot of employees, you already understand that you pretty much are everything, right? And so you're going to be on that food safety team as well, and it may only be a couple people because that's all that's in your organization. Those of you that are larger, that might not be. Oh, we do have our results. Okay, so we have 7% of people answering that yes, they have a food safety plan, so that's very cool. We have 36% saying nope, no food safety plan. But then half of you, 57%, say you do not sell food products. Okay, so then really this talk about food safety plan for those people is just, you know, maybe some understanding about food safety when it comes to the products that you purchase as a consumer. So because all of those products that you have in that grocery store that you bring home to make breakfast or lunch or dinner would have a food safety plan. So now you can, I'll give you some factoids that you can share at the dinner table to your friends or family. Some of them are good, and some of them, you know, you might want to wait till after dinner, but we'll talk about some of that. Those of you that have a food safety plan, you know, just take a gander at it and see maybe where we can improve it or modify it. And then those of you that do not have one, pay attention to the resources because the resources will help you develop that one as you get further along in that process. So back to the preliminary steps here. We have our first one, assemble the HACCP team. We'll talk about what makes a good team, describe the food and its distribution, intended use and consumers, and then we make that flow diagram. So when we talk about your HACCP team or food safety team, it's important that it's multifunctional, multiple levels of service, and multiple levels of management. But like I said, you know, generally a food safety team should have about 6 to 10-ish people. You don't want to have too many people because then nothing ever gets done and everyone gets to argue, and on the other hand, you'll have just the same 2 or 3 people talking, and then everyone else is taking a nap or figuring out what they're going to make for dinner tonight or breakfast, depending on what shift they're on, right? But you do need to have about 6 to 10 people. Understanding though that those of you that are small, that use family and kids and friends and your food safety team's gonna be smaller. But you're still gonna meet those requirements, right? Because you are the maintenance manager, you are the warehouse manager, you are sales and marketing, you are distribution, you are on the make because you're on the processing floor. And so you still meet all of those requirements. It just happens to be that you wear many different hats. So you have to think about it from many different areas and aspects. Don't be afraid to bring in subject matter experts, SMEs, not pirates, for those of you that are old enough to remember that. I say that and now half my participants go, what are you talking about? But some of you know SME, so you can bring in subject matter experts. So don't be afraid to reach out to resources and have them help you. Describing the food in its distribution. Every product that you make should be made under a food safety plan, but not every single product needs its own food safety plan. So for instance, let's say you make 2 different types of cheeses. Maybe you make a cheddar, and then maybe you make some kind of flavored, something with some herbs or spices or things like that. You have to think about, how different are the processes, and can you combine those under one food safety plan so that you don't have to have a food safety plan, for every single product, but every single product has to be made under some sort of food safety plan. And so it's pretty normal if you have multiple products, you can combine them under one food safety plan. Now, if you sell meat products and you make cheese and you make yogurt, and you probably have 3 food safety plans because those processes are widely different from each other. So you have that decision with your food safety team. How many food safety plans do we need based on the products that we're selling? And then you start talking about, what are the characteristics? Are there any food safety characteristics? Does this product have a micro issue? Most of your dairy products and meat products have the potential to be contaminated with microorganisms because they support the growth. So that's we have to deal with. What kind of packaging do you use? Do you have any storage and distribution conditions, shelf life, things like that? That all pops up in that describe its food and its distribution. And then the next thing is your intended use and consumers. And so you have to have a thought as to, what does your consumer do with your product? How do they use it? Do they further process it, or is it considered ready to eat? Do they have to cook it, or do they just pop open the package and start chowing down? And so you have to have that consideration, because when we start talking about the hazards associated with your product, you need to know how your consumers are going to use it, and also how are they going to misuse it. Okay, so think about easiest one I always talk about is like cookie dough. It says very clearly, do not eat. This is a raw product, needs to be cooked. But how many of us are like, one for me, one for the pan, one for me? So you have to think about how your consumers are going to misuse it, even though you tell them not to. So think about that. Then this is just an example. Again, this is a goat cheese and cow cheese product description for a food safety plan. Yours may look very similar. You might have some of the same characteristics or some maybe not, but just wanted to provide you with some examples. And so this one is, like I said, for cheeses. And so you can see we have to store it appropriately. We have an allergen situation there because milk is one of the big 9 recognized by Food Allergen Labeling Consumer Protection Act and the FASTER Act, which added sesame. Packaging, things like that. And so you'll have a product description very similar. This one also has intended use and consumers as well on it. Just ready to eat product. That brings us to our flow diagram. Your flow diagram does not need to be a graphic design. It could just merely be boxes and arrows. But your flow diagram is going to start basically at receiving. For some of you, most of you are probably, if you do make products, you are both the producer and the processor. And so you have to kind of, again, put on the different hats and make that decision over when does the processing begin and when was the ag products side. Because your food safety plan really starts with that processing begins. And so you're receiving. And so, for instance, for those of the that making dairy products, when the milk passes out of the milking machine into some kind of balance tank, you probably start the processing. Some of you have parlors and have a little processor, so really when it goes through that door, and then it's now part of the processing. That's where your food safety plan begins. So that's where your flow diagram begins. Those of you that have meat products, generally it's kind of at the slaughter step. So when you are basically bringing the animal to the slaughter step, that's where your food safety plan begins. And then it goes all the way through your process until the end when you don't own it. So whether that's at, like I said, like a farmer's market kind of situations, or whether that's at retail, it's wherever you do not own the product anymore. And so also where you don't have control over it. So once you've delivered it to that retail location, you really can't go in and stock it and manage it and watch it. So really it's kind of your delivery, right? It's the distribution. So that's where your flow diagram ends. That's where your food safety plan ends. So it begins at receivings and ends somewhere around shipping and distribution. And I think I have here, yep, there's another example, one of cheese products. So you can see receiving of packaging, receiving of ingredients, receiving of that milk, and then it goes through the process. And so, like I said, nothing fancy. Those of you that have friends that are graphic designers that really like computers, I did once have an intern that had me little milk tankers and little vats and little centrifugal pumps and things like that. And that flow chart was adorable for the longest time until he left and we had to make changes, and none of us knew how to draw all his cute little figures. And so it went back to the boring boxes and arrows, but it was adorable for a while. So nothing fancy is needed. Okay. So that takes us out of our 5 preliminary steps. Once we've created our flow diagram, we verify it by taking a walk, and that's it. So those of you that have food safety plans, take a look and see if you've done those 5 preliminary steps and if your flow diagram and product description and things like that. That moves us into the principles. Now, where the preliminary steps were highly encouraged with the PC rule, but not required, were required for HACCP. Preliminary steps are both. So both the principles, let me state that correctly. The principles are required for both, and they are the same for both. There's just some nuances when we get into that hazard analysis. So you conduct your hazard analysis, you determine your critical control points, you establish critical limits, monitoring, corrective action, verification, and record keeping. And so the hazard analysis is really the heart of your food safety plan. That is where you take your flow diagram and you look at this, you look at all of the hazards of the biological, chemical, and physical. So those 3 categories. And you look at the act of receiving the milk or the act of presenting the animal for slaughter. Is there any biological hazards that could be associated with that step, with the equipment, with the processes, with the practices, things like that? Is there any chemical? And we'll go through kind of the list of what is considered a chemical hazard. And then the final one, is there any physical hazards? So foreign material. Then you take the discussion of your food safety team, which is what is the severity and what is the likelihood. And so we probably don't have unlimited funds and unlimited time. So we really just have to deal with what is of sufficient likelihood to warrant its control. So I always use the example of, in Idaho, we have some breezes every once in a while. Melinda and I were chatting, last week was pretty breezy. And so, you know, what is the likelihood that we're going to have 40, 50 mile an hour winds? Well, it's pretty likely, happens quite often. And so building code is designed so that you can't have a building that could not withstand said 50, 60 mile an hour winds, right? What is the likelihood that a meteor is going to strike the building you're sitting in? Probably pretty small, you know? And so, of course, our building codes are not designed to require buildings to be able to withstand meteor strikes. So, severity and likelihood. What is the likelihood? If you can say that is never going to happen, that has never happened, I've been making product for X amount of years, then it's probably not something we need to spend a ton of time on. Where something like, what is the likelihood that I have coliforms on my grubby little fingers right now? Pretty darn likely. Everybody does. But, you know, severity is of at least a medium. People get sick from coliforms. It is the family that gave us E. coli and salmonella. And so what do? We make sure to wash our hands before handling product. We wear gloves before handling product. If we pick up something from the floor, we wash our hands before handling product. And so again, severity and likelihood. So if something is pretty likely, of sufficient likelihood and severity to warrant its control, we put in policies and procedures. I just be careful. There are tons of food safety plans online that you can easily get a hold of, but make sure that you review them and that they are applicable to you. Because if you think about it, you know, we're talking about foreign material. If I have all brand new equipment that's designed for the use of the product that I am making, I'm going to have a totally different hazard than if I have older equipment, you know, where I've had to weld the welds because I've had to weld it so many times, and equipment that's not really designed for the purpose I'm using it for. It's more likely to give me a foreign material situation than that brand new fancy design first situation. And so, although you can get those food safety plans, make sure that they meet your process, they meet your facility, they follow your flow, and so make those modifications. As with anything, when we start talking regulatory, food safety plans are a potential subpoenaable document. So you could have to stand in front of a court of law and defend your decisions on your food safety plan. And so you want to make sure that you have documentation. Some of us don't even remember what we had for dinner 2 nights ago, not alone remember why we made some decision on a hazard analysis 8 months ago. So take good notes when you're creating your food safety plan and when you have your meetings and updates. So like I said, hazard analysis, we got 3 hazards: micro, chemical, and physical. So micro, we're talking about biological, we're talking about prions and protozoas, viruses, bacteria, those kinds of things. Chemical is a much broader category. We'll talk about all of those, and physical. Okay. So microorganisms, we have, if you have a meat product, those of you that are familiar with beef products, you understand issue with bovine spongiform encephalopathy or BSE or mad cow. So you have to sign the document about 30 months of age, or we've got to separate out brain and spinal tissue and ganglia and things like that. Viruses, it's not going to necessarily be living in our food products, but we transmit via use the food as a vector, right? So viruses are non-living. They need a host to be able to replicate. And so norovirus, #1 cause of all foodborne illnesses. There's something like 11 million noroviruses infections every year. They say about 7 million are caused by infected food handlers. So somebody has norovirus, sneeze into my hands, and then touching your food. usually in more of a restaurant service kind of situation, but not necessarily. Hepatitis A, we've had a few of those recently. Had on oysters, had them in water. There's been a few restaurants in different parts of the country that had an infected food handler. So viruses. Bacteria. Bacteria are pretty much what most people associate with recalls, right? So you hear Salmonella, Listeria, Staph aureus, Clostridium perfringens, or botulinum, those kind of guys. Again, they're going to reproduce through binary fusion. So they are able to divide themselves in half. And so depending upon the growing conditions and depending upon the microorganism, they can divide themselves in half in as fast as 5 minutes. And so if you have a product that we maybe weren't very clean on removing the hide, and so we all know there is microorganisms in air and water and on animal skins and things like that, on our own skins. And so you're removing that, and you might not have had it as clean as possible. Odds are you are going to transfer some of the microorganisms to that inner tissue. That inner tissue is a perfect growth medium. And so that's why we have lots of bacteria recalls, cleanliness situations, equipment cleanliness as well, things like that. Fungi, so yeast and molds. Generally speaking, although yeast and molds are a potential food safety issue, it's more food quality. But if you have a soft tissued product or you make a soft cheese, you would be worried about yeast and molds. Molds give us aflatoxins, which is a chemical. According to the World Health Organization, that is the #1 growing food safety issue. And so we can talk about that more later. And then parasites. Think about trichinosis, giardia, cyclospora, those guys. Remember, it's both water and food products. And so having a good clean water source can also give you some of these microorganisms. So we take our flow diagram, we look at the biological. Now let's talk about the chemical and then the physical. So here's some resources for biological. Foodborne illnesses, that's an FDA document. The A to Z index of foodborne illnesses, that's a CDC document. My favorite, Bad Bug Book. This one is perfect to go look up some factoids to share at the family table, because the Bad Bug Book tells you all the symptoms you're going to have if you are infected by one of these lovely microorganisms. And of course, they're very detailed and discussing your projectile vomiting and things like that, and your bloody diarrhea. And so you can bring up some of those factoids while you're partaking of your break and lunch and dinner. Like I said, some of these you might want to wait till afterwards, but it depends. If you wish to torture your friends and family, there's a lot of good facts in here. Chemical hazards. So like I said, this is a pretty broad category when we talk about chemical hazards. Allergens is #1. So allergens, I don't know how many of you have a food allergy or have a friend or family member that has a food allergy, but it's the protein in that product that makes the immune system see it as a foreign body and attack it. And so some people will have mild symptoms, your tongue gets very swollen and your lips might be swollen. You might have some hives, but some people actually have a much more severe, so anaphylaxis. That's where you have rapid blood pressure loss and your throat will close so that you can't breathe. And so it is a life or death situation for some people with food allergens. So it is the #1 cause of all class 1 recalls right now, has been for a few years. So it's very important that you declare if you have an allergen and take a look at your ingredients. It's amazing if you look at the big 9, how many products contain milk and how many products contain egg and peanuts. I had a small dairy producer. They were making a ranch bacon cheese, and everything was going fine till we took a look at the ingredients of the ranch and it had egg in it. like, oh crap, we now have a different allergen that we were not planning on, that we don't have verification of, that we have not guaranteed we're cleaning off of our equipment. So, went and asked, hey, can you make this ranch without egg? And that way we could eliminate that allergen situation. We had a processor that was making beef jerky, and he used Worcestershire sauce. Well, if you don't know what Worcestershire sauce comes from, it comes from fish, fermented fish. And so he was not declaring fish on his ingredients. And so that was a national recall. So keep in mind, take a look at those allergens. Toxins, so mycotoxin, aflatoxin, think about grains and things like that. Coffee, tea, those kinds that could be potential. Heavy metals is also a chemical, drug residues. And so, you have to think about, not every one of these hazards does your ingredients or your process have, but some of them do, right? So think about the processing chemicals, think about your oils, greases, lubricants, think about harvesting equipment and things like that, especially if you have different ingredients that you're adding as flavors. Pesticides, herbicides, cleaning residues, dioxins, those kinds of things. That's all falls under chemical. Most of them, when we start talking about meat and dairy products, it's really that allergens conversation, and then of course drug residues, and then oils, greases, lubricants, things like that. So we're gonna skip through that chemical. That one sometimes makes people's brains hurt. So again, if you have questions, thoughts, ideas, we can chat more about that. Physical is just going to be all of those foreign materials. So think about all the rubber, think about gaskets, think about seals, things like that. So rubber, plastics, metal, bone, and again, you make a T-bone, that's expected to have a bone, but something like a chicken nugget's not expected to. So you have to keep that in mind when you're talking about the types of products that you make. When we talk about physical hazard, we talk about choking size, so 7 to 25 millimeter for an adult. Keep in mind, if you have kids eating that product, it's going to be smaller because their throat is going to be a smaller diameter, so they have a potential to choke on a much smaller size. We've had our conversation about likelihood and severity already. Sometimes it's helpful to kind of think of a matrix. Some people visualize that better. But then we put in our preventive measures, and so we know we have micro on our hands. That's why we wash our hands, and that's considered a prerequisite program. And so let's run through some of those. We're not going to go into all of them, but let's chat about some of the bigger ones. These are some to kind of, do some history looking around what maybe products very similar to yours have had recalls or warning letters. You can go look at both FDA and USDA. So those are the websites for that, or you can just Google FDA food recalls, USDA food recalls, things like that. There are draft guidance for both FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, Preventive Controls for Human Food, and USDA HACCP. HACCP, on USDA, they have a small and very small guidance, and they have example models and a food safety document for helping you put together your food safety plan. So definitely go take a look at those. These are hazard guides. So we spun through those hazards pretty quick. Both USDA and FDA will have guidance that through each common step or common ingredient, they tell you what is commonly found. So whether it's a microorganism, whether it's a chemical contaminant, or even a physical. So take a look at all those resources. They will be great to help you out. Also, never underestimate your own experience. So you've been making product for a while. You might have employees that have been making products for a while. And so what has happened? And so don't discount that as well. So we talk about there's some differences between HACCP and preventive controls. And so The preventive controls, where we called everything prerequisite program, they have some of our prerequisite programs are considered preventive controls. So process, food allergens, sanitation, your supply chain. The reason why is there's many recalls that are not caused by anything you did, but by an ingredient you used. And so you want to make sure you're only buying ingredients from reputable sellers, reputable dealers, reputable manufacturers. So let's talk a little bit about GMPs, or good manufacturing practices. Both USDA and FDA have those. This is the bare minimum to process. These are the food safety requirements in order to have a facility that is safe to process food products and have equipment, controls, hygiene standards, things like that for both people and the equipment. And so obviously we're not going to go through all the subsections, but this is the hand washing and the hair nets and the sanitary design of equipment. This is how you, what kind of processing steps you have to have, things like that. Sanitation, wet or dry sanitation. So kind of the basic 6 steps, you clean things, you pre-rinse them, you wash them, then you rinse that out, you inspect and sanitize. And so sanitation helps us out with all 3 classifications: biological, chemical, and physical hazards. So sanitation, imagine that you got to clean stuff, right? You do have to clean before sanitize. The 1 rag with bucket of chlorine is not your full sanitation program. So make sure that you understand your soil loadings. Make sure you understand the type of equipment that you need to properly remove those microorganisms. So microorganisms are so tiny you can't see them. So it's not like you can visually see if something is clean or not. So you got to make sure you got a good sanitation program. Make sure that everybody understands that. Those of you that have kids or spouses or roommates or things like that, you understand that there's probably been some arguments at one time or another about whether something is clean to a certain standard, and whether you're the lax standard or the higher standard. Your idea of clean is not the same as my idea of clean, which is not the same as your spouse, kids, friend. So make sure you have procedures. Again, wet cleaning and dry cleaning, both are just as acceptable. Both are just as capable of removing biological, chemical, and physical contaminants. They just have to be done right with the right equipment. We talked about the allergens, so you got the big 9. So milk and eggs, peanuts and tree nuts, wheat, soy, fish, crustacean shellfish, and sesame. So those are the big 9 in the US. Count for 90% of all allergens. There's still those weird ones out there, those of you that are allergic to coconut or mangoes or papayas or some other things, but these are considered the big 9. You'll have an environmental monitoring program where you swab your facility or equipment, things like that, to try to find any microorganisms before they get to your product. So that's another prerequisite program. Use a zonal approach, zones 1 through 4. 1 is product contact, 2 near product contact, 3 within the processing area, but further removed from product, like walls, drains. And then zone 4 is outside of the processing environment, like offices and things like that. Water and air quality. So water is not sterile, air is not sterile. You want to make sure you got the right filtration. You want to make sure you've got positive and negative air pressure so that you're not sucking in unfiltered air, you're pushing your filtered air out. That your facility has the right traffic patterns so that you're making sure to meet those GMPs, those sanitation concerns. Like I said, the supply chain program, making sure that you only buy from approved suppliers and they're reputable and they're not going to cause you trouble. How you receive goods, how you ship goods, the carriers and things like that. And then maintenance, right? Your preventive maintenance and calibration and things like that to make sure that you don't have equipment that breaks down while you're in the middle of processing. training. You know, we are not born in utero with all the knowledge that we need. So you got to tell people common sense is not common. And so you need to train everything to make sure people understand what you need them to do and how you need them to do it. Using the proper chemicals for a food plant, making sure they're segregated. You don't store WD-40 right beside your bleach, right beside the food grade oil or lubricants that you use on the bearings. Traceability recall so that you can, if something does go wrong, you can get it back as fast as possible. And then pest control. You know, not too many people want to have flies in their product and bird excrement and things like that. So this is an example of a hazard analysis. This is, again, we're cow and goat yogurt. And so we can see this is the raw milk receiving step. And so we go through and we have our B stands for biological, C for chemical, P for physical. You have the biological hazards, chemical hazards, physical hazards. Is this of a sufficient likelihood to warrant control? Yes, no. Why? Some kind of narrative or justification. And then what are you going to put in place to significantly reduce that? And that's where a lot of those prerequisite programs we came up with. And so here's one example. I think I put in another example as well. Yep, this is again that yogurt, the batch pasteurizer, where we have the potential to have a few hazards. And so what are we going to do to fix that? You can see that there. So that's principle number one. Oh, we have a question. I wasn't paying attention to the other screen, and I noticed we have a question. What should the food safety plan cover when we raise the livestock, have it butchered at a USDA inspected facility, and then deliver the frozen meat to the customer? Really, what your food safety plan then covers is just that delivery portion. And so you, depending upon the facility, depending upon your customer, your food safety plan could just be one box of you picking it up at the facility, the USDA facility, and making sure that the temperature doesn't elevate a certain amount of degrees until you deliver to somebody's freezer. And that's it. Simple, easy peasy, not a problem. So hopefully that answers your question. So I remember there is 7 principles. We've covered principle number 1. Principle number 2 is you determine if you have a critical control point. And so if you have a hazard that does not have any, is not mitigated to an acceptable level by your prerequisite program or by your preventive controls, then you have a CCP. Those of you that make dairy products, generally your CCP is somewhere around that heat treatment, that pasteurization kind of situation. But some of you may have metal detectors, especially in the meat processing, may have metal detectors. And so that would be a common CCP. Some of you may make dried products, probably not that common at a small scale, but your water activity, things like that. Then we move on to our critical limits. Your critical limits are that go, no go level. So think about your pasteurization, it's your time and temperature. If you have a plate heat exchanger, it's also the backflow. So your back pressure, sorry, and things like that. It's that minimum maximum value that is making the product safe. Generally speaking, critical limits are going to be something we can measure in-house. So think about time, temperature, product thickness, pH, stuff like that. We can get meters to do that. We can do it pretty easily in-house. Takes us 30, 90 seconds. We know if our process is in control or not. Here's some example of critical limits. Pretty normal to have them be multiples. So you can see there, like pasteurization, it's time and temperature. Like drying in an oven, it's the temperature plus the time plus the flow rate plus the product thickness. Those of you that, you know, you make a pretty thick cheeseburger, it takes a little bit longer to cook it than if you got the little flat guys. That brings us into number 4. So 1 is hazard analysis, 2 is critical control points, 3 is critical limits, 4 is monitoring. So this is the paperwork to make sure that we are doing what we said we were going to do, and that we're following through with the frequency and things like that. So who does that? How do they do it? When do they do it? What equipment do they need to do that monitoring, those kinds of things, log sheets. That's what this comes up to. Then we have corrective actions, because of course nothing ever goes wrong and everything always goes to plan. But if you know one of those weird things that happens, you have corrective actions. So a couple of things with corrective actions is how are you going to get your process back into control, and what are you going to do with any impacted product? And so think about if you had, if you're pasteurizing, you didn't get to the right time and temp, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to start your pasteurization over again. If you're a batch system, you probably didn't have any impacted product. But if you're not a batch system and some product got out but didn't get pasteurized appropriately, you know, you're going to have to deal with that. And then verification. So again, us checking that we are performing our plan as expected. So this is us doing audits on ourselves, our internal audit program. Because, you know, if you never check up on something, again, those of you that have friends, family, spouses, roommates, if there's nobody monitoring that you're doing something, then you're probably going to let some things slide. And so that's why we verify and make sure that's occurring. And a lot of times the verification is just kind of review of log sheets, maybe do some product testing, things like that. We're finally to our last principle, everyone's favorite, paperwork, right? Everyone loves paperwork. And so documentation. Remember your food safety plan, the subpoenable document. So making sure that you have all of your programs, policies, procedures in place. This is an example again of that cheese of a pasteurizer fulfilling those 7 principles. So the hazard is the potential for pathogenic bacteria, which raw milk has. We have plenty of recalls, plenty of scientific literature that says so. So we have to pasteurize it. We have PMO, the pasteurized milk ordinance. How are we going to monitor that? Well, we're going to take temperature and time. We have a chart every batch, and it's the cheese maker that does that. And then what are we going to do if that doesn't go right? We're going to isolate the product, restart the pasteurization, and move on. Verify by reviewing that log sheets, documentation, things like that. So that's an example of a summary doc. All right, keep in mind paperwork, you know, it's blue or black ink only, not purple glitter pens, not pencils. Make sure that you can read it, no whiteout or correction fluid. And then making sure that you're recording the information at the time that it's occurring. You do need to review these records. Your HACCP says that the HACCP coordinator needs to review those records. The preventive control says the PCQI or preventive controls qualified individual has to review those records. PC rule says within 7 days of make. HACCP just says before you ship. All right, we kind of ran through that pretty fast. Does anybody have any questions about your food safety plan? I do not see any up there. Okay. So how do you maintain the system? Well, there's checklists, there's regular training, attend some webinars, there's tons of free resources out there to help you manage your food safety plan, to help you make sure the people that are doing the things are trained, all of those kinds. Annually, you have to reassess your food safety plan to make sure that it's still accurate. PC rule says every 3 years you have to. USDA says annually, unless you have something like new equipment, new products, new ingredients. Maybe you have a new intended use in consumer. Maybe you have an adverse regulatory finding, or you're auditor had a comment that needed to be modified. Those are all kind of events that might trigger reanalysis more frequently than once a year. But if none of that happens, then once a year is what you got to do. All right, so I spun through that pretty fast to give us time to have any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, anything anybody wants to chat about with your food safety plan.
And that's a lot of information. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. As a reminder to all of our attendees, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box and we'll discuss. But I'll kick us off. And I see that Chad has also joined us, so if he wants to ask anything as well. But I guess the question that I have is, I mean, obviously a lot of the stuff that you talked about is really important from just human safety and all of that. But at what level are these types of analyses and food safety plans required? As far as, I mean, I know it's probably variable from state to some degree, but
pretty much if you're going to sell products for consumers, you need to have some kind of food safety plan. And so any, your health districts or your Department of Ag, they're going to want to see your food safety plan. And then obviously, if you start getting out into interstate commerce and we start having to fall under feds, you have to follow through. Now, there are, with USDA, with the FSMA, there are some exceptions for very small on some of the procedural views, but you still have to have a food safety plan. It's just some things might be a little smaller just because you are a very small producer. But anytime you sell food products, you should have a food safety plan.
Yeah, I think it's really important, particularly some of the ways that you outline that could go south. So what do you recommend if you are having trouble with one of these things? Say you have a foodborne that's popped up and maybe you didn't track who bought your products, or I mean, what kind of I mean, obviously the best plan is to figure it out beforehand, but what if you didn't and this happens, and do you have some ideas there?
Well, it kind of depends on what the issue was, right? And how did you find out? So there's customer complaints that are just nuisance customer complaints. That's my verbiage, not regulatory. Where it's like, this tastes funny, or I didn't like this texture. And so, you're stuck with those. But did you find out that there was an issue because somebody said they got sick from the product? Or somebody said, I found this bolt in the product that you gave me. Then we've got to investigate. We've got to do what's called root cause analysis. And there's a variety of tools to figure out, what is the most likely cause of that issue. Then we have to kind of figure out how much product could be impacted. So if it's one bolt and there's only one bolt missing from a slicer, we probably don't have much product because obviously the one person found it. And so if you say, thank you very much, and here's some free product and move on with life, right? But if it's a micro issue and you're kind of a batch process, then you probably have more product that is impacted. And so you have to get out however information you can. And so unfortunately, sometimes that's painful. But if you can call, if you have any way of calling, if you can post notices, if you can put something on your web page, social media, that's a lot of times you hear about recalls through social media. Anything you can do just to try to make sure somebody doesn't eat the product and get sick.
Yeah, so along those lines, if you're selling at like a farmer's market or something, is there a way that you can track without people feeling invaded as far as who they are and what they're purchasing?
Yeah, so I mean, sometimes you might have a point of sale kind of system where you can track contact information and things like that. Even just putting out a sheet of paper and asking people if they're willing to put their contact information and you can kind of notate what they purchased. Those are all systems that, again, it's more paperwork, it's more questions. You might have to, they might ask you, well, what are you going to do with this? Are you going to spam me? And you're going to, no, we're just tracking who we sell our product to, so we know for sales or something like that. But any way you can get that information, the more information, the better.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and it makes it hard when you're a small scale, but at the same time, if something were to happen and you're tracking them, you have a better chance of being able to reach people. So
right. Yep. And just understanding, even if you just keep logs of how much product you sold where, because then that at least gives you kind of an understanding of maybe what all is out there. And that information is good for you to also understand when you're doing your business plans and when you're trying to figure out your cost benefit analysis and things like that, and what products are selling the best, where are you selling, what products are going to what consumer, and those things are helpful in those business decisions as well as a food safety decision. So even just keeping track of, I sold blank amount at this farmer's market and I sold blank amount of this product here on this day, then at least you have something to go off of.
right.
That's great. That kind of was going, by the way, great presentation. I apologize for getting on a little late, but that kind of goes with the question I had, is many times it's hard to make deliberate decisions as producers when we're not tracking the right information, when we're not keeping records of our sheep or goats. So would you say that information you've talked about is some of the more necessary information to keep before even devising a food safety plan? Or
yeah, especially, it all depends on what products you're selling and how you're selling them and things like that. But yes, that is all very important, all at the front end.
And then I had another question. What is maybe one of the concerns that you see for some of our producers who are not directly selling food products, but obviously all our animals go into the food system at some point. What would be something that you would like people to be aware of, maybe management wise or something else, as their animals go into this system?
Well, there's all the animal health concerns because we are eating that product. And so even understanding, the types of forages and things, whether there's pesticides, herbicides, that kind of a situation, that's all going to go into the tissue. That's all going to go into the milk, the heavy metals stuff, things like that. A lot of those chemical contaminants are really all sitting at the producer level. Because it's not like at a processor, if I'm making, if I've taken a lamb and I'm cutting them into different cuts, it's not like I'm adding pesticides at that point. But
right.
if the antibiotic residue is already in the animal because of a treatment situation, it's going to come out in the food products as well. And so it's really that animal health and your managing of their nutrition and things like that really impacts that end use product.
Great.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that something we as producers don't always keep in mind is some people have that level of sensitivity that they can pick up some of those allergens in what we feed to our animals, right? So if it's corn or wheat or whatever it may be that they're allergic to, and they have to keep that in their mind. And then the way that we market animals being grass finished versus grass raised, and whether there was ever a period of time where those animals maybe were eating something different than just pasture grass. So I think that's something that we don't consider a lot of times in our animal production systems that really can impact a consumer. So
yeah, even if we get out of food safety land and we get into food quality and you get into organoleptic properties or texture, taste, things like that, what an animal eats comes out in their milk and in their meat products. And so, I worked in the dairy industry a lot. And so I could tell when there was cows that were eating potatoes because their milk tasted different. than cows that were eating sugar beets and all those byproducts and things like that that we use because they're cheap and they provide a carbohydrate or protein source. It comes out in their products. And so even from a food quality standpoint, just that animal health and nutrition greatly impacts us.
Do you have any just random side knowledge on consumer palatability of certain types of feeds that go into milk or meat? Just out of curiosity.
No, not necessarily. There's things like you can't feed onions because that will come out in the milk. And so I used to be able to tell that if they did throw some onions into the TMR, I could just lift the lid of a milk tanker and you could smell it. You could see potato, you get a different texture on the milk when you've had animals feed a lot of potato byproducts. And so those are generally not a flavor profile you're expecting in your cheese and yogurt. I don't know of anybody that makes a potato cheese, but maybe that's a new consumer try there. They do have the macaroni and cheese ice cream. I've yet to taste it, but I was very odd flavors. But a lot of consumer trends are buying local, so that's pretty common. And that we have our palatability, our tastes have changed, and so different flavors and things like that. International flavors that we normally wouldn't have eaten is pretty common and sought out by consumers. But those kinds of things to think about.
Yeah, we definitely live in a world now where consumers are willing to try new things, and I actually am one of them. I like to do all the different flavors, so I'm not saying I like them all, but I will try every one of them. So
yeah, there's definitely more adventurous eaters. My husband's not one of them. We are very, very bland flavored people that he does not like to try new things, but I like to. So I find it fun when somebody has a new product, especially when I get to go to plants and I get to taste their products. Like, oh yeah, I'll try that.
So this is our cry to all of our attendees that if you want to get in our good side, send us some product, right?
Oh yes, yes. Oh, I tell that all the time. Yes, if you're wanting, free consulting and things like that, if you feed me whatever your product is and it tastes good, I'm there. I'm on it. Yep.
Okay, so with that being said, how can people reach out to you if they're wanting more information? Do you have that? Okay, great. And your work with primarily people in Idaho, but you have contact with anybody in the other states in your same realm of the world. And so feel free to reach out to Yana, whether you're in Idaho or not, to get the right path forward, right?
That's fine. You've got email there and cell phone there, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I know we covered a lot of material very quickly, and that not, based on the poll, not everyone's really concerned about food safety plans. So if there's something else though that comes up that you have any questions about, feel free to send a comment or thought, and we can find you somebody that can help out.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have found you as a connection for our group of people. And thank you to all of our attendees online and those of you who watch later on our YouTube channel, which is the University of Idaho Extension Livestock channel. So we'll get this talk posted there. And you guys have a great rest of your month. I hope that it's cooling off and a little more moisture and everybody's gearing up for breeding is what we're doing. So
yeah, fall is here, whether you like it or not, it's here.
Yep, absolutely. So, all right, well, thank you. And we'll talk to you guys later.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye.
Bye.